There's a photograph that used to sit on nearly every mantle in America. A boy, maybe 16, standing proud beside a car that isn't even his. It's his father's, or his older brother's, or some second-hand Ford held together with hope and duct tape. He's grinning like he just inherited the world. Because in a way, he had. For most of the 20th century, turning 16 in America meant one thing above all else: you were getting your license. Not eventually. Not if your parents felt like it. Almost automatically, the way you'd expect your next birthday to arrive. It was less a milestone than a rite of passage, as fixed in the American calendar as a graduation or a first communion. And today, that ritual has quietly, almost invisibly, come undone. Fewer than a third of America's 16-year-olds hold a driver's license now. A generation ago, that number was closer to two-thirds. Something fundamental shifted in how this country raises its children, and almost nobody agreed to it out loud. To understand what was lost, you have to go back to a time when the car wasn't just transportation. It was liberation itself, sitting right there in the driveway. Picture a Tuesday afternoon in 1962, somewhere in the flat gold light of a Midwestern suburb. A station wagon idles in a school parking lot, and inside it sits a driving instructor with a clipboard and the patience of a saint, teaching a row of nervous 15-year-olds how to parallel park between two orange cones. Driver's education wasn't an extracurricular back then, it was practically sacred civic infrastructure, baked right into the high school curriculum alongside algebra and American history. Schools bought fleets of dual-brake sedans just for this purpose. Insurance companies gave discounts to kids who completed the course. States built their entire licensing timelines around the assumption that every teenager, without exception, would learn, and they wanted to learn. That's the part that's easy to forget now. For a teenager in post-war America, the driver's license wasn't just a card in a wallet, it was the key to an entirely new dimension of life. Before the car, a teenager's world was small: the house, the school, the few blocks you could walk or bike. After the car, that world cracked wide open. Suddenly there was the drive-in theater on a Friday night, the burger stand 2 towns over, the freedom to just go, with no particular destination and no adult in the passenger seat. Sociologists at the time practically wrote odes to it. The car was where teenagers became themselves, away from their parents' watchful eyes for the very first time. Parents, for their part, mostly encouraged it. Handing your 16-year-old the keys wasn't seen as reckless, it was seen as responsible. It meant your kid could get themselves to their after-school job, ferry younger siblings to practice, run errands for the family without anyone having to rearrange their day. In an era when both suburbs and highways were expanding at a breathtaking pace, a driving teenager wasn't a liability. They were useful. They were, in the truest sense, growing up. This was the culture that gave America its mythology of the open road and the teenage cruise. Drive-in restaurants built entire business models around carloads of kids circling the parking lot on a Saturday night. Songs were written about it. Movies were built around it. The sound of a distant engine on a summer evening was, for decades, simply the sound of adolescence itself. But somewhere in the final years of the 20th century, the mythology began to fracture. And the cracks didn't come from nowhere. The first real fissure was safety. By the 1980s and into the 1990s, researchers were producing sobering numbers. Teenage drivers, statistically, were involved in catastrophically more accidents per mile driven than any other age group. Insurance companies had known this for years and priced accordingly, but now public health officials started sounding the alarm too. States began experimenting with something called graduated driver licensing, a staged system that delayed full driving privileges, restricted nighttime driving, limited how many passengers a new teen driver could carry. It was, by nearly every measure, a triumph of public policy. Teen fatality rates dropped substantially in the states that adopted it, but there was a quieter consequence nobody quite predicted. By making the path to a license longer, more bureaucratic, and more expensive, these well-intentioned laws also made it easier to simply put the whole thing off. 16 stopped being an automatic milestone and started being merely the earliest possible starting line, one that plenty of families no longer felt any urgency to cross. Then came the money. Driver's education, once a fixture of the public school curriculum, began disappearing from school budgets across the country through the 1980s and 90s, a casualty of tightening finances and shifting priorities. What had once been free, or nearly free, was pushed out into the private market, where a course could run several $100s. For working-class families, the very families who'd once relied on teenage drivers to keep a household running, that price tag mattered. And insurance only made it worse. Adding a 16-year-old to a family policy could nearly double the premium overnight. For a lot of parents, doing the math simply meant delaying. Meanwhile, the country itself was changing shape around its teenagers. The suburbs of the 50s and 60s had been built, almost accidentally, for teenage independence, sprawling enough that you needed a car, but full of destinations worth driving to. The America a teenager grew up in by the 2000s looked different. More families lived in denser cities or new-build subdivisions oriented entirely around the adult commute, with fewer of those teenage third places, the drive-in, the roller rink, the soda counter, left to drive to in the first place. If there's nowhere to go, and no reliable reason to go there, the license itself starts to feel almost beside the point. And then, arriving quietly in the late 2000s and taking over completely within a decade, came the device that changed adolescence more than any single force since the automobile itself, the smartphone. For half a century, the car had solved a very specific teenage problem: how do I see my friends without my parents in the room? The smartphone solved that same problem without requiring a license, a car, gas money, or insurance. A teenager in 2012 could sit in their childhood bedroom and be more socially connected to their friends than a teenager in 1975 driving across town ever was. The freedom the car once delivered in the physical world was now available, instantly and for free, in the palm of a hand. Researchers who study adolescent development started noticing the pattern by the mid-2010s. The generation growing up glued to screens was, across nearly every measure, delaying the traditional markers of independence, dating, working part-time jobs, and yes, getting a license, later than any generation before them. There's a parenting shift tangled up in all of this too, one that's harder to measure but impossible to miss if you live through it. The generation of parents raising teenagers in the 2000s and 2010s had come of age themselves in a very different climate, one saturated with news coverage of crime, of abduction, of danger lurking just beyond the front door, whether or not the statistics actually supported that fear. Independence, once assumed, became something to be managed, scheduled, supervised. A teenager driving off alone at 16, once the picture of responsible growing up, started to feel to a lot of parents like an unnecessary risk in a world that already felt risky enough. Why rush it? There would always be time. And so 16 became 17, became 18, became whenever they're ready, a phrase that would have sounded almost foreign to a parent in 1965. Put all of it together: the safety laws, the cost, the vanishing driver's ed programs, the changing suburbs, the smartphone, the anxious new style of parenting, and you don't get one single villain. You get a slow accumulation of small, reasonable decisions that, together, dismantled a tradition nobody ever formally voted to end. No law banned teenage driving. No headline announced its passing. It simply faded, the way a photograph left too long in the sun slowly loses its color, until one day you notice the image is barely there at all. What's been lost is harder to quantify than any statistic. That first solo drive wasn't just about transportation, it was one of the last true unsupervised rites of passage American childhood had to offer, a small taste of consequence and competence and trust, handed from parent to child in the form of a set of keys. Whatever has replaced it, the phone, the delayed independence, the extra years of supervision, may well be safer. The numbers, at least, suggest it is. But it's worth pausing on that station wagon in the school parking lot, that clipboard, those orange cones, and asking honestly whether something quietly essential got left behind along with them. Because for 100 years, the sound of an engine turning over in a driveway was the sound of a kid becoming an adult. And in more and more American homes today, that sound has simply gone quiet.